Welcome and hello, everyone. I'm Jospa Petrinic, President and CEO of CUTRIC, and I'm welcoming you back to our second annual Low Carbon Smart Mobility Technology Conference series with mayors from across Canada. It's my pleasure to introduce today here Mayor of Edmonton, Don Iveson. At CUTRIC, Mayor Iveson, we believe cities are core to the innovation of transit and smart and shared mobility for the future. And for those audience members who aren't as familiar with Edmonton, to give you a little bit of background, Mayor Iveson has served in his role since 2013. He previously served as a city councillor, and he led the city at a time, and still does lead the city at a time, when Alberta itself is going through an extremely challenging period in terms of the oil revenue coming into the province and into the city's budgetary bottom lines. And yet in the middle of all of this, Edmonton is still one of the country's leaders in electric bus innovation and transit innovation. And for those folks who aren't as familiar with Edmonton Transit Services, it has over 1,000 buses, so it's one of Canada's largest fleet systems. And it has nearly 100 light rail vehicles. And as a former resident of Edmonton myself, I can say that I lived and breathed by the transit system, and in one of the coldest climates in this country, it somehow figured out how to go electric and make it work. It's an exciting time. As a city, it's an exciting time for mayors, but it's also an extremely challenging time for mayors. And with that, we're going to turn to you, Mayor Iveson. I'm going to hand you the virtual microphone to get your first preliminary insights before we head right into questions from our members and our audience participants.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to be a part of this event, albeit virtually. The city of Edmonton was the first major city in North America under 1 million to build light rail back in the 70s. And we're still running some of those vehicles, actually. It's getting due time to replace them. But there's been a lot of innovation here. The street I live on used to have a streetcar running on it. Then it had electric trolleys. Now it has community buses. And it was actually my son a couple of years ago when he was old enough when I ran for re-election for that to be a family conversation. And I said, is it okay if I do this? Because it has impacts for our family, obviously. And he said, yeah, as long as you do something about the buses. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I don't like getting off it and the bus drives by and I get a face full of exhaust. Can't they just be electric? And so the electrification lobby hits close to home here, and that was one of my son's conditions for me running. And now I was already there because we've done some cold weather testing, and I really want to see this technology work. We're very open and interested in the hydrogen economy and what retrofit diesel buses with hydrogen supplement or hydrogen fuel cell could look like. So we're technology optimistic and agnostic. Though right now our big push is around battery electric, and we're sort of working to set the Canadian standard around that on top of a electrified light rail system that will double in terms of kilometers of track in the 2 terms that I've been leading the city as mayor. And so serious commitment to public transit. And just one more thing I'll say, obviously we'll talk about public transit challenges in the realm of COVID, but and I have a lot to say about that. But I was just at the hardware store, actually, and sometimes people recognize me and sometimes they don't. In this case, someone did and came up to me and he started giving me an earful about transit. He said, I bet you haven't even ever been on the train. And I said, yeah, I take it to work 1 or 2 days a week. And he was just aghast that the mayor would take the train. And people are often very surprised to see me using public transit. But I'm not just an advocate, I'm a rider as well, a strap hanger of the old school. And so I don't just believe that it's a good thing for the city. I believe it's a good thing for my family and for my own environmental footprint and my own public health too, walking and biking to the train and socially the chance to meet people. So makes for great main streeting on the LRT platform or on the bus or on the train. So I'm a big supporter of public transit. This is a very challenging time for public transit, but no doubt out of this is going to come a lot of new learning and innovation, both about the service itself, as well as the technology that we're going to need to make it cost effective and environmentally positive and sustainable into the future. So happy to be part of the conversation.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, and I'm glad to hear that you do take transit to work a couple days a week. Now, I personally believe, and certainly as the head of an innovation consortium in transit, I have a bit more of a radical view that I don't think as CEOs of transit systems, we should even have parking spots. We should own our product, but that's another conversation for another day. So I'm going to take you to something you just said. Imagine it's pre-COVID, about 4 months ago, which is hard to do. If there were not the economic circumstances arising from COVID, but there were the economic circumstances arising just from Alberta's fiscal structure and its oil-based structure, what would have been the future innovative technologies in transit that you would have said 4 or 5 months ago are going to define transit in Edmonton? Like the big ticket items that the City Council was really focused on integrating, deploying, or innovating.
Well, and in that sense, as long ago as 4 months seems on the front end of this pandemic, because we were making intergenerational strategic plans about bus network redesign, about fleet conversion to zero emission, and about aggressive expansion of our light rail system as the backbone of it, as well as rapid bus and tiered service, and regionalization of transit is another thing we're working on with majority of our urban neighbors around us, forming a regional transit commission to put more seamless service in place. Another piece is deployment of long overdue contactless fare payment, which I wish we'd had in place before COVID, but it will start to come online for testing later this year and get full rollout over the next year. We're seeing if we can accelerate it, but like any transit IT project, you have to walk before you face plant or run. You got to be very careful, and we've had some challenges with transit IT here, which I won't go into. But the other thing I would say is that in addition to all of that transit policy and transit system planning and transit technology, we've also been working very diligently on the land use side here in Edmonton, and very shortly we'll hold the final public hearing on the process of eliminating parking minimums from our zoning bylaws. So we will have the most progressive urban policy with respect to parking, so that it won't be the default expectation. I mean, the market will still be able to set whether there should be parking, but in my neighborhood, where there's a light rail station just over there, because I'm working from home today, I'm very happy to see new development coming with very little parking, and eventually more and more people able to live without parking, because they've got really good cycling infrastructure right there, upgraded pedestrian infrastructure, crosstown bus service, as well as higher order transit with the LRT. So we've also been getting the land use piece progressing to support adoption of transit and reduced car dependency in the city, all as part of a strategic shift to improve affordability, improve public health outcomes, improve environmental outcomes, and have a more social and mobile city as well. So lots of, and all of that logic applies, pandemic notwithstanding. And certainly people who weren't big fans of public transit and didn't want us to spend money on rapid transit expansion before this have, as in many places, pointed to pandemic and said, well, clearly we should stop all transit, because in a time of pandemic, people don't want to use it. But our ridership went from normal to, at worst, about 20% of normal. But for those people, that was how they got to their essential service jobs. So it still is an essential service very clearly. And as we ramp it back up, maintaining physical distancing and operating a system that now has a multi-year structural deficit until ridership revenues recover is a real challenge for us. But on the infrastructure side, particularly the federal support we've enjoyed is secure out to 2027. We're working with them to fulfill their promise to make it permanent, fulfill their promises with respect to zero emission vehicles. Still a bit of a hit and miss across the province, across the country, with provinces matching the federal government and local government's commitment around transit infrastructure investment and innovation. But because these were intergenerational moves we were making, COVID disrupts them, but doesn't derail them, so to speak.
You know, I used to live in Edmonton Gold Bar and around Faculty Saint Jean. And, you know, it's great living there because it has access to the river valley, one of the best places in the world, I think, to run. But I didn't have a car and it was hard to get around because Edmonton's not very dense. And so hearing you talk about creating urban density to drive more transit is really exciting. And that points to the next thing that I think a lot of our members would want to know about and participants here. You mentioned the essential nature of transit. And for a lot of us who just don't own cars, it's the only way to get around. So you can't just disappear it or reduce it. If we were to imagine that transit becomes essential, defined as essential as utilities, electricity, water, is it feasible in the future to think of Edmonton growing transit, or cities like Calgary and Edmonton and Fort McMurray growing transit big enough to start absorbing some of the workers who would have found themselves on the outside looking in the collapse of oil or transition to a green economy? I mean, there's a lot of workers in Alberta. And as an Albertan myself, there's a lot of people unemployed right now who are looking for good jobs. And if we grew transit as an essential service, is that an opportunity for job growth in the city?
I certainly think that enhancing labor mobility gives the labor force more resiliency when going through an economic transition like we are going through. And so I think that transit investment generally supports that. I think that creating not just more higher density residential, but a couple of the transit oriented developments we've approved in your old neighborhood where the line will open within the next year or so, the Southeast line, Valley Line Phase 1, we call it, they include employment nodes as well. So making sure that there are opportunities from people living here and working here and vice versa to double load the system. You know, the great transit systems of the world, the ones that come closer to recovering their costs at the fare box, are sort of double barreled or double loaded that way, with people traveling in all directions from mixed use points of origin to mixed use destinations, and with attractions well connected around the city. So long term, that's what our both our rail plan as well as our bus network redesign aims to improve those options for people. And to the extent that, you know, we've enjoyed some of the highest income, second only to Calgary, and the Calgary numbers really tilted by historic white collar C-suite oil and gas, which has really diminished in recent years too. So the Alberta overall earning numbers per capita are still fairly high. And as we go through this, you know, that position may erode relative to the rest of the country. And so to the extent that more families will be having potentially affordability challenges as housing costs continue to rise for them, though they're stable at the moment, giving people those lower cost alternatives for the mobility of their household, so that maybe they can have one car payment going instead of two, and free up that money for other necessities or belt tightening if times are tight. And certainly the economic outlook in Alberta was challenging before this. It's more challenging for all of us now, but the double whammy effect is a particular concern. So that's where affordability of public transit and its ready availability for more people is an economic enabler and is an important and very efficient use of community resources, household by household and employer by employer, if they choose to support the ETS at Work Pass program, for example, and incent their employees so that they don't have to pay for parking stalls for them, for example, and can choose different places to locate their employees in their offices. So I think it's strategically part of city building, and it's even more important for people whose incomes have been disrupted, short-term or long-term, to have it as an essential service. So I think we do see it as a utility. It's one of the reasons we've kept running it. It has started to look doubtful for us about the sustainability without provincial and federal aid. Whether we'll be able to continue to offer it at the same level of service with the distancing. And it just blows my mind that within the first month of the crisis, the US Congress, which is not known for doing things quickly, didn't just approve, but actually started to distribute $25 billion in aid to American cities for enhanced cleaning and to support the implosion of fare box revenue to maintain the sustainability of their essential service in public transit. And in Canada, we're still playing jurisdictional hot potato between the premiers and the prime minister about who's going to help our cities. So that's a bit disheartening, but nonetheless, cities soldier on.
Yeah, and let's actually dive into that issue a little bit because, we do live in this fantastic confederation as it is, which does mean jurisdictional division of power. And you're at the city level having to manage that. And recently you penned an op-ed with Mayor John Tory and Maxime Penneau-de-Jobin on the challenges facing municipalities, in particular as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you speak to us a little bit about the challenges that you identified, which you're hoping the feds and the province step in to help resolve post-pandemic? And specifically, could you clarify what is it that the federal government should be doing given its mandate, and what is it that the province should be doing given its mandate? Because the general ask of money, well, we all get that, but in this confederation, they each have different roles. And what are those roles that you're looking for to be fulfilled?
Sure, and that is the $10 to $15 billion question for mayors across the country, and we think that about 3/4 of that need, assuming the crisis runs out to between September and the end of the year in terms of impacts to city budgets, about 3/4 of that need is general impact felt by all municipalities, large and small. So many of us have closed rec centers. Many of us are deferring revenues. There's significant uncertainty about what property tax delinquency will be when the deferrals run out. Costs related to PPE, costs related to supporting vulnerable populations. Some of these categories of expenditure are disproportionately high in the bigger cities as service centers for their regions or for their whole areas of the country. So not just metropolitan regions, but for us, Northern Alberta, whereas people have lost their jobs or become housing insecure, they have come to the city. So our homeless population has grown in this crisis, and our need to respond to those challenges has grown with it. So there's general exposure for all municipalities to the tune of, if the crisis lasts to September, we think about $7.5 billion, and about $2.5 billion, which is about 1/10 the American number, which is about right, is the public transit number specifically. And this is unrecoverable operating losses related to lower ridership, which is partially offset by some service cutbacks. So it is net of some contraction of service. We've reduced our service initially about 60%, and then we're starting to ramp it back up with the stages of reopen in Alberta. Ridership's back up to about 50% of what it was. So for us, that's still about $5 million a month that we're light. In Toronto, at the worst, it was $20 million a week that they were light at the fare box. So it becomes exponential exposure the bigger your transit system is. And so particularly Toronto and Montreal, the numbers are staggering, and their mayors are dealing with a lot. But this is the thing from speaking to them regularly as chair of Canada's big city mayors, that is literally keeping many of us up at night in the big cities, is the transit exposure, and knowing that it may take years for ridership to recover absent a vaccine or herd immunity, but that we can no less diminish the service. We may have to actually lay on more service than we were before for less riders, and that the gap taken out over many years as ridership recovers for us is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's why that aid is so critical. If we knew that we were going to have support going forward, we'd be in a much more confident position than we are right now, and in the position our American colleagues are in. In terms of roles and responsibilities, initially we went to our provinces, most of us, because we are technically under Section 92.8 of the old Constitution. We are creatures of the province. But we all get the same answer from our premiers and finance ministers 3 months ago, which is, we're broke, we can't order money, we can't, no one will buy our debt. The feds have to bankroll us. So we thought by that point, after the federal government had moved more than $100 billion very quickly and urgently and properly out to vulnerable households, people who had lost their jobs, small businesses, and we were saying that should be a way ahead in line of municipalities, but don't forget about us. And so challenges, here we are, 10 weeks later and counting. And at least the federal government has put some money on the table to draw the provinces out. The $14 billion the Prime Minister said he's willing to work in areas of provincial jurisdiction, including support for cities. So that's unlocked the conversation. And the challenge is some provinces are in better fiscal shape than others. Most of them are liquid again right now, so they should play a role. As to how that will break down, I'd love to give you an opinion on that, but we are, of course, excluded from those conversations. They happen at the First Minister's table, closed door, without us, as sort of the third class order of government, able to contribute. But it should be fair and equitable to taxpayers, according to fiscal balance sheet capacity, but cities simply don't have the capacity to float these challenges, and the property tax hit for next year to recover these revenue shortfalls would be double digits in most of the cities, and like in the 20s and 30s and 40s in some of the cities that are most exposed. And that's clearly the last thing the economy needs as we try to safely restart together.
Well, let me ask you on that. I mean, I live in Toronto now, and I'm planning for that property tax bill next year, whatever it may look, or years forward. But, for a question specific to Alberta, it is one of the provinces that hasn't historically had a provincial sales tax. And on top of it, has had really robust oil growth. And there's been that ongoing dialogue, certainly if you're an Albertan, about did we save when times were good so that we would have flush cash when times were poor. Situated as you are, and hindsight's 2020, what are the options ahead when you're looking at a province? If you can philosophize on it, there is now dialogue about a provincial sales tax. Is there any of that dialogue coming your way in terms of a mechanism of supporting cities locally? Or is it, as you say, you're on the outside still looking in and you're not getting any insight from First Minister's meetings?
Well, the easy dodge is to say that's way above my pay grade, and I've generally stayed out of provincial politics. But as an Albertan, I've long felt that we've been betting the farm on $100 oil for the last 10 years, and it was there for a couple of years, and then it was 80, and then it was 60, and then it was 0. And so that was never a good bet. And complaining to the rest of the country that we can't pay our bills when we refuse to pay our bills ourselves isn't a good look. So I don't support that strategy. And I think that there is a fiscal reckoning in Alberta that is coming home to roost now. And some of it's around expenditures, but some of it is also around structural deficit, because revenue-wise, if we had British Columbia's rate card, essentially, we'd have $11 billion more dollars annually, which would mean that we'd have had a $3 billion surplus last year instead of an $8 billion deficit. So that's the next lowest tax jurisdiction in the country. So so there is a valid critique there, I think, personally, as a citizen of Alberta. But I don't get to make those decisions. But what I will say is that I do think that the fiscal reckoning is coming for all provinces now because of the challenges of COVID, and Alberta is no exception. There's no escaping it. And so if that crisis forces us to really square the circle and eliminate at least the structural deficit and treat the deficit that we have like everybody else this year, that is very cyclically, hopefully short relation to COVID specific, and we're all agree we're going to pay that back over the next generation on very low interest rates, and that stimulus should be part of that, and continued infrastructure investment for competitiveness should be part of that. I can get behind and support all of the rationale for that. And but to the larger extent that this is also breaking cities and some provinces, now would be a good time, or shortly in the aftermath of this, once our urgent operating shortfall issues have been dealt with, to have a robust conversation about the fiscal framework for all orders of government, and to reduce the exposure and reliance of cities on our sole source of taxation, which is the property tax, which is a wealth tax and is not particularly flexible, and doesn't respond to people's ability to pay. And a situation like this really shows that inflexibility. And so we've long argued that either through revenue sharing or through delegated authority to collect, like most American cities do, a piece of a value-added tax or a piece of an income tax in partnership and efficiently with other orders of government. I don't want to establish a whole new revenue division for the city of Edmonton, but there's got to be a better way for cities to have an upside in the prosperity that we help drive for the benefit of our communities and businesses, for the benefit of our metropolitan regions and extended service areas, and for the benefit of our provinces in the country. Because I really do think cities are a principal driver, and we don't get a direct piece of that upside now. And when we're betting the farm on a recovery, we'd like a piece of that recovery, especially if we're going to be asked to carry the bag for these shortfalls that we're dealing with now.
And that actually leads, you presaged the question that we wanted to get to also, which is, what is the role of cities? If we're looking at climate action, we're looking at mobility as an essential service, we've kind of hidden behind this constitutional framework that's long treated cities as just the byproduct of provinces and a federation that's more important as a decision maker. And yet fast forward to 21st century, around the world, we're recognizing cities are going to be the solvers of the climate action crisis. And yet in Canada, we haven't positioned them to do that, in part because of, as you said, not inflexible revenue generation goals. In our meeting with Bonnie Crombie, in our interview with her, in our chit chat, she really raised quite profoundly the fact that she's behind road pricing and anything that would generate some kinds of new revenues. Very innovative. And I've always been a fan of John Tory's statement around the idea of toll roads and road pricing. It's something that we're certainly behind in terms of innovative financing and flexible funding for cities who are supposed to be the leaders. And you're the leader of the big cities mayors. The reality is cities are supposed to solve the climate crisis, and in Canada, they're treated like the runts of the pack without the ability to actually do anything about it. So what is the future for cities from your perspective? What has to change constitutionally? What kind of revenue tools should you be given and made more powerful to engage with?
Well, let me start by saying that I think the federal government has taken two important and bold positions on this that will ultimately be part of the larger energy transition and unlocking economic opportunities that come with it, innovation opportunities, new technology, the jobs related to making this transition, which hopefully are pathways to employment and relevance for people whose skills are transitioning in the energy business and in manufacturing and in all the other areas of our economy that are being disrupted, both by energy transition and now by pandemic, and also by changes to global trade patterns as people turn back inward and question globalization and question supply chain resiliency. So we're in a period of profound disruption there, but we have to find the opportunity in it. We have to look to the resiliency of our cities as economic drivers. And I really think Canada is behind, but I'll come back to that in a second, because I do want to give federal government credit for two things. And this is not a popular position in Alberta, but it is a position we defend here in the city of Edmonton, that you have to put a price on pollution to create the right incentive structure for the new technologies to be adopted that reduce or avoid entirely that pollution. And so whether that's carbon or whether that's holding polluters to the polluter pay principle in any situation where there's externalities that are being borne through extreme weather, which is causing us to have to spend $1.5 billion in drainage system upgrades to try to right size our capacity to deal with the storms of tomorrow based on the modeling we know we're already exposed and locked into. So those are real costs. Our insurance premiums in Alberta after yet another extreme storm continue to go up with, I think now 8 of the 10 largest insurable loss incidents in recent Canadian history having been in Alberta, between the Fort Mac fire, floods in Calgary previously, and now this devastating hailstorm that they're contending with on top of everything else. So pollution pricing is critical, and I've long supported that since before it was popular and became unpopular again here in Alberta. But you need to get that financing and incentive structure right to make this transition. I really do believe that. To help unlock the innovation capacity of business and finance to help us solve this challenge, because we can't regulate. I don't think we can regulate our way to the answer. I think we have to market transform our way to the answer with a regulatory floor that includes pricing. And the other thing I'll give the federal government credit for is reaching out to work with municipalities through the Green Municipal Fund and other initiatives that endow and protect dollars to work directly with funding and financing through grants and through low interest loans, things like some of our electric bus pilot projects, for example. And so that innovation capacity, the information sharing, and the source of funds to do the early adoption part of market transformation and testing new technologies and partnering directly with local governments is very welcome. We want to do more of that on housing, more of that in public health, more of that in innovation and economic diversification, because we think that's the way forward as provinces move further and further into austerity. So that direct relationship is critical, and setting a clear direction for the country and bringing local governments along directly and not relying on provinces to pull them along is critical. So I think those are all part and parcel of opportunities for the federal government to keep momentum in this space, and that particularly the zero emission vehicle goals, I think, will help us accelerate in this area. And if they wait for provinces to come along that just refuse to buy into this change model, we'll hold up the opportunity to hopefully create some great Canadian industry capacity producing these vehicles, not just for us, but for the world. So I'd love to see that kind of innovation unlocked as not just part of our climate work, but also as part of our industrial and economic strategy in this country.
That's fantastic, Mayor Iveson. I know we've run out of time, but to summarize what I've heard here today, there's a real opportunity for the federal government to be working with cities directly, and there's already evidence that that's happening. And there's also leadership there in climate pricing, or rather in carbon pricing for climate action, and funding to cities for green infrastructure. But as you said as well, and as a leader of large cities in this country, as Canadians, we need city leadership, and we're delighted to know that you're at the helm of it, along with some of your colleagues across the country. Just a matter of empowering cities to actually be able to act to the degree that you've identified. I will conclude by saying—
May I just say one more thing on that real quick, which is that even within our own country, the provinces that are betting on their cities, like British Columbia and Quebec, they're the ones that are winning economically right now, and socially and environmentally. They're getting the outcomes done, because if you have all three orders of government pulling in the same direction, extraordinary things are possible. But even more importantly, out there in the world, the countries that are betting on their cities to drive their strategies, not just to the benefit of urban elites, as is often sort of described in this attempt to wedge city dwellers and our rural friends apart. It's the whole metropolitan construct, from the resource community to the manufacturing center to the port to the industrial suburb to the office towers, to all the different ways that people live and move around in between them seamlessly as neighbors. When that gets wedged apart, which our politics has sadly done in this country, we lose the opportunity to compete with the world. And those countries whose cities are positioned to drive metropolitan level success to the benefit of their whole region or whole country, those places are kicking our butts. And so it's a competitive imperative across social, environmental, and economic outcomes to lean into your cities. And the sooner provinces figure that out, the provinces that figure that out first will win in confederation. But if the whole country can figure that out, we can slay across all of these different policy areas. And I'd love to see the day. We're a little ways off from that yet, unfortunately.
It's not an exaggeration to say Canada is a great place to live. That's certain. I mean, I come from an immigrant family myself, and our cities have so much more potential to them than what they're living up to today. We can be the humanistic global hubs where people come to do great and amazing things. So your words are well taken, and I'm going to ask you if there's any final thoughts you'd like to share with folks joining us today in our conference on electric mobility specifically, and whether everything that we're facing right now and what you're facing is going to slow down the move to electric transit or electric mobility for the future. Any final thoughts on that to guide us?
I hope not. I think the technology is moving so quickly. The financing tools are coming into place. I'm seeing more and more e-bikes in our community, more and more electric vehicles in our community, more interest in electric fleets and the industry side and the public service side. So I think that transition is happening. I think new technologies are coming along. Some of the I mentioned hydrogen and the blue hydrogen opportunities that our resource sector, and particularly our petrochemical cluster around here, we can be players in all aspects of that transition. And I don't want to see the opportunity passes by, because I think the world's still going that direction. Albertans are going in that direction. Humans are going in that direction because they want to do the right thing. And there is still this imperative to make this energy transition in short order for our future. And I think that's not lost on people. And if COVID's shown us anything, it's that when we decide that we have a crisis and need to act with solidarity and with purpose, we're capable of it. And people have been telling us for the last generation or so that human beings can't do that, and we can't come to that kind of consensus, and we're not up to that kind of change. And we've shown through this crisis that we are. So let's build on that for climate, for economic resiliency and innovation, for social inclusion and justice for people who've been left out of the great quality of life that most people enjoy in Canadian cities and Canadian communities. I really do think that this is a great reset moment for our civilization, for our country, and for our cities. And of course, electric mobility and zero emission future's got to be part of that.
So it sounds like from coast to coast to coast, Canadians are innovators, and with cities leading at the helm, we can lead our way into technology solutions that help save not only ourselves, but the planet, frankly. Mayor Iveson, fantastic words to end on. We really appreciate your time. We know you're pressed for it always. Thank you very much, and we look forward to being able to help anything we can do in Edmonton and beyond to move to electric mobility and to move to a low carbon smart mobility future for all of us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And